Princeton University announced on Saturday that it will remove former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's name from its public policy school. One of Princeton's residential colleges, formerly known as Wilson College, will also get a name change. The decision comes after the university president and board cited Wilson's, quote, racist thinking and policies throughout his presidency from 1913 to 1921. For more on this, I am joined by historian Blair Imani. Her most recent book is Making Our Way Back Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Blair, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am particularly excited about this change. I talk about Woodrow Wilson in my book.
Well, I want to talk about that more because I think that for many people, they hear Wilson's name and they think about the League of Nations, World War I, and don't know about his troublesome past. So help us understand the racist actions that were carried out by the 28th president.
Absolutely. So I think what's important to start with is that Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856, at a time when enslavement was still something that was legal in the United States. And he's claimed to be the first president where he didn't have an attachment to slavery. You know, a lot of other presidents either owned slaves themselves, but because he was, so young when slavery was allowed, it's thought that he didn't have a connection to slavery. However, the truth is that while his family didn't own slaves, they leased slaves from the church that was owned by that family, by the Woodrow Wilson, by Woodrow Wilson's parents. So I feel like that's even more insidious. And of course, that colors and shapes his adolescence and his growth at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was starting to wane in interest. He decides to air Birth of a Nation inside of the White House, a film that was largely responsible for a resurgence of interest in popular culture around the Ku Klux Klan. And beyond that, he did very little to help Black people, particularly African Americans in the South, during a time when lynching was at its highest. But he spent, loads of money on investigating shark attacks in his, home of Long Island. So it's one of those things where he was someone who had the ability to stand up for Black people in this country, but because of his upbringing, because of, the social attitudes at the time, he took that call, or he declined that call, and it shaped life for people like my ancestors.
I thought it was very interesting in reading up on Woodrow Wilson that both his win, his presidential win in the very first election, was in part because of alliances he made with African American and Black leaders here in the country. And can you also tell us a little bit more about how the federal agencies were not segregated, but became more segregated under Wilson's watch?
Absolutely. So to understand this, we also have to understand Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction was previous to Woodrow Wilson's presidency, but it was a time when about 1,500 Black men were appointed to positions on the state, local, federal level. Under Wilson, there were still some remnants of this. And of course, like all politicians, we see him making gestures towards the Black community. We see this more under Roosevelt in more meaningful ways because you have Mary McLeod Bethune coming in and being able to solidify those in positions of office. But with Wilson, it was something that was very surface level, something that was very symbolic. But at the end of the day, he still had allegiances to white supremacy, particularly to the white Southern Democrats at the time, who were very keen to keep Black folks in a certain position. But what Wilson does is represent somebody who comes from the North and somebody who is willing to position themselves as someone who is beyond racism, a scholarly man. But as we see just across the country, racism isn't localized. It's something that is a nationwide plague, worldwide plague, and Wilson exemplifies this.
And this is going back to the Princeton question, not the only racial diversity issue that Princeton has had to deal with. Some students have called out the public policy school's lack of diverse faculty and curriculum. So has Princeton announced any other actions? I know that you have spoken at the school before and have also been involved in some ways in calling for some of these reforms. Has Princeton announced any other actions that they intend to take to deal with the legacy of systemic racism besides just this name change?
To my knowledge, they've yet to really reach back out to individuals, especially faculty members that have already been calling for these changes. The thing that we're seeing right now, especially in the past month, is this groundswell of interest in calling out white supremacy and taking anti-racist action. But most institutions, haven't just been sitting around waiting for somebody to call on. They've actually been silencing and actively suppressing students who've spoken up about this. You can see this at Harvard, you can see this at Duke, and of course at Princeton as well. An institution as old as Princeton is going to have a lot to reckon with. So name changes, that's important. That's crucial, because you don't want to have students coming into an institution every day where they're erasing the truth and the legacy, the racist legacy of someone like Woodrow Wilson. But I think what's necessary step is for them to reach back out to faculty who have been going through these very hard times and to say, hey, we listen to you, we hear you, we grant you tenure, we grant you, we're standing in solidarity. Because at a lot of institutions, what we see is that the few Black faculty that exists, or people of color faculty that exist, are forced to take on these extracurricular duties of supporting Black students because that infrastructure doesn't exist with the institution itself.
I think that's a really good point. So the president of Princeton University released a letter, an opinion piece in which he said that the school had previously honored Wilson without regards to, and perhaps even in ignorance of, his racism. He argued that the last time that Princeton thought about perhaps removing Wilson's name, they looked at all the other good things that he had done and thought that the good things that he had done potentially outweighed or allowed them to turn a blind eye to the racist, troublesome history of his past. You mentioned some other universities. I'm wondering what role you think Princeton is now playing in setting an example for these institutions.
Well, so the thing is, we have to understand historical figures in their totality. We have to look at them as whole people. We can't just pick and choose the things that we enjoy about them and then ignore the harms that they've done. Because in fact, just like you and me, we try to do good in the world, but at the end of the day, we might be harmful in some ways, and that all has to be taken under consideration. I think about Cecil Rhodes and how, monuments to Cecil Rhodes were being torn down in South Africa, and how crucial that is, because while it's something very prestigious to be a Rhodes Scholar, you still have to recognize that Cecil Rhodes made his wealth on the backs of Black people, on the backs of enslaved Africans, on the back of, colonization. So do we uplift Cecil Rhodes because, it's prestigious, or do we look at his whole totality and say, hey, maybe Cecil Rhodes, maybe people like Woodrow Wilson are symbolic, are important, do have their place in history, but we can't just erase these other things, because that's not responsible. People call me an activist historian because I'm so dedicated to uplifting these truths. I like to say that I'm just an accurate historian because I'm not willing to turn away and erase the bad for the sake of the good. We have to have both. We have to have it all.
Well, when we look at the entire state of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson has been significant not only to Princeton, but throughout the state. He obtained his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, later was a professor. He became the university president there, won a Nobel Prize, was New Jersey's governor. How do you think he will be regarded by the state? And if you were advising New Jersey, what would you say?
I say that's all very important and crucial. However, like I said, when Woodrow Wilson took it upon himself to investigate 3 shark attacks in Long Island to preserve the tourism there, instead of allotting federal dollars toward the investigation of lynchings of people like my ancestors, you have to wonder at what cost were these great strides made. At a time where he was enrolled in Princeton, was it segregated? Likely so. It's things where you have to consider, is this person, any given historical figure, doing something at the peril of other people? And are those other people systematically disadvantaged because of those differences? And in this case, absolutely yes. I think when we look at Birth of a Nation being aired at the White House, that's basically giving the Ku Klux Klan carte blanche from the highest office in the land, the presidency, to say, hey, Ku Klux Klan, save America. This is what America means, and basically patting, virulent racists on the back to say, go forth and, do harm while not protecting Black folks. So I think, yes, let's remember Woodrow Wilson as the great man he was. Let's also remember him as the flawed man that he was, because we can do both. We can remember the great things, but we can also hold accountable the harms.
Now, one more question for you before I let you go. There are people who say that these historic figures had made their way in the world during troubled times, in which there wasn't a recognition of so much more that we have learned about what's right and what's wrong, and were more products of the culture and the society at the time. What do you say to people who are concerned about erasing George Washington's legacy because he owned slaves, or any of these other historical figures? How do you reconcile, as you're saying, honoring the good while standing up against the bad?
Absolutely, and I think Washington is a great example. We learned that Washington had wooden teeth. Washington had teeth made of the slaves that he owned and possessed teeth. So he had another human being's teeth in his mouth, a human being that he owned. You know, that's one way that we can reconcile these truths and understand that we're not just learning about the bads all of a sudden. The bad has been washed away, and, you know, the blood upon their hands has been washed clean, and then we learn about these people as virtuous. But truly, there's a lot of insidiousness that has taken place. So I think that it's not so much about erasure, but it's so much about realizing that enslaved people that were enslaved at the time Woodrow Wilson was born, the enslaved people who were leased by the church his parents ran, they knew slavery was bad. They knew this was reprehensible. They were not being listened to. So it's not that we've had a revelation on moral standards within this country. It's that we're now listening to oppressed peoples, and that we've decided to have a better moral compass rather than saying, well, it was fine back then, because it still wasn't.
Well, I'm going to have to do some more reading about George Washington. In the meantime, Blair Imani, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.